Pontius Pilate sent a report to the then Roman Emperor Tiberius about the ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Probably the most incredible part of his account was the eyewitness testimony of the soldiers stationed at the tomb and the supernatural events they saw and felt on the day of Jesus' resurrection. Things not recorded in the gospel. That's what we're talking about today. I can't wait. And we're starting right now. This is the third of a three-part series on the report written by Pilate about Jesus. As we mentioned in part one of this series, it appears that a true report from Pilate likely existed. You can click in the upper right of the screen right now to view that segment if you haven't already. The second part was about a secret meeting between Pilate and Jesus. Click in the upper right again to view that portion if you haven't seen it. And if you want to watch all the way through the end, which is what I recommend you do, we'll have links at the very end of this video. And this is the third and absolutely most amazing portion of Pilate's testimony. His view of the trial, crucifixion, and resurrection, including eyewitnesses. But before we get to all that, let's begin with Pilate's account of the trial. The great feast of the Jews was approaching, and the intention was to avail themselves of the popular exultation which always manifests itself at these solemnities of a Passover. The city was overflowing with tumultuous populace clamoring for the death of a Nazarene. I found that interesting. Did you know that the entire population was clamoring like that? Well, Pilate then gives us a hint of why the population of Jerusalem seemed to be against Jesus. My emissaries informed me that the treasurer of the temple had been employed bribing the people. Haha, that's it. It was money. I mean, we should have known that. Pilate continues. The danger was pressing. A Roman centurion had been insulted. I wrote to the prefect of Syria for 100 foot soldiers and as many cavalry. He declined. I saw myself alone with a handful of veterans in the midst of a rebellious city, too weak to suppress a disorder and having no other choice left but to tolerate it. He then goes on to talk about the trial. They had seized upon Jesus and the seditious rabble, although they had nothing to fear from the praetorium, believing with their hearts that I winked at their sedition, continued vociferating, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Three powerful parties had combined together at that time against Jesus. First, the Herodians and the Sadducees, whose seditious conduct seemed to have produced from double motives. They hated the Nazarene and were impatient of the Roman yoke. They could never forgive me for having entered the holy city with banners that bore the image of the Roman emperor. And although in this instance I had committed a fatal error, yet the sacrilege did not appear less heinous in their eyes. Another grievance also rankled in their bosoms. I had proposed to employ a part of the treasure of the temple in erecting edifices of public utility. My proposal was scowled at. The Pharisees were the avowed enemies of Jesus. They cared not for the government. They bore with bitterness the severe reprimands which the Nazarene had for 3 years been continually throwing out against them wherever he went. Too weak to act by themselves, they had embraced the quarrels of the Herodians and the Sadducees. Besides these three parties, I contend against the reckless and profligate populace, always ready to join a sedition and to profit by the disorder and confusion that resulted therefrom. Jesus was dragged before the high priest and condemned to death. It was then that the high priest Caiaphas performed a derisory act of submission. He sent his prisoner to me to pronounce his condemnation and secure his execution. I answered him that as Jesus was a Galilean, the affair came in Herod's jurisdiction, and ordered him to be sent hither. The wily tetrarch professed humility, and protesting his preference to the lieutenant of Caesar, he committed the fate of the man to my hands. Soon my palace assumed the aspect of a besieged citadel. Every moment increased the number of seditionists. Jerusalem was inundated with crowds from the mountains of Nazareth. All Judea appeared to be pouring into the devoted city. Pilate then describes the dream of his wife in much more details than the gospel accounts. I had taken a wife, a girl from among the Gauls, who professed to see into futurity. Weeping and throwing herself at my feet, "Beware," she said to me, "beware, and touch not that man, for he is holy. Last night I saw him in a vision. He was walking on the waters. He was flying on the wings of the winds. He spoke to the tempest and to the fishes of the lake. All were obedient to him. Behold, the torrent in Mount Kidron flows with blood. The statues of Caesar are filled with Gedamine. The columns of the Interium have given way, and the sun is veiled in mourning, like a vestal in the tomb. O Pilate, evil awaits thee if thou wilt not listen to the vows of thy wife. Dread the curse of a Roman Senate. Dread the powers of Caesar." By this time the marble stairs groaned under the weight of the multitude. The Nazarene was brought back to me. I proceeded to the halls of justice, followed by my guard, and I asked the people in a severe tone what they demanded. "The death of the Nazarene," was the reply. "For what crime?" "He has blasphemed. He has professed the ruin of the temple. He calls himself the Son of God, the Messiah, the King of the Jews." "Roman justice," said I, "punishes not such offenses with death." "Crucify him! Crucify him!" cried the relentless rabble. The vociferations of the infuriated mob shook the palace to its foundation. There was but one who appeared to be calm in the midst of this vast multitude. It was the Nazarene. After many fruitless attempts to protect him from the fury of his merciless persecutors, I adopted a measure which at the moment appeared to me to be the only one that could save his life. I proposed, as it was their custom, to deliver a prisoner on such occasions, to release Jesus and let him go free, that he might be the scapegoat, as they called it. But they said Jesus must be crucified. Now, to this point, this part of the report is very consistent with the Gospels. But then we see Pilate had an intimate knowledge of Jewish governmental law that Christians today are totally unaware of. I found this next segment very, very fascinating. I then spoke to them of the inconsistency of their course as being incompatible with their laws, showing that no criminal judge could pass a sentence on a criminal unless he had fasted one whole day, and that the sentence must have the consent of the Sanhedrin and the signature of the president of that court, that no criminal could be executed on the same day as his sentence was fixed, and on the next day, on the day of his execution, the Sanhedrin was required to review the whole proceeding. Also, according to their law, a man was stationed at the door of the court with a flag, and another a short way off on horseback, to cry the name of the criminal and his crime, and the names of the witnesses, and to know if anyone could testify in his favor. And the prisoner on his way to execution had the right to turn back 3 times to plead anything new in his favor. I urged all these pleas, hoping they might awe them into submission. But they still cried, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" So, knowing that Pilate's motive in preparing this report to Caesar was to justify his actions, again, I found this very consistent with those motives, trying to show that he had taken every possible avenue to avert problems. Pilate then continued. I then ordered Jesus to be scourged, hoping this might satisfy them, but it only increased their fury. I then called for a basin and washed my hands in the presence of that clamorous multitude, thus testifying that in my judgment Jesus of Nazareth had done nothing deserving death. But in vain, it was his life these wretches thirsted for. Often in our civil commotions, I have witnessed the furious anger of the multitude, but nothing could be compared to what I witnessed on this occasion. It might have been truly said that all the phantoms of the infernal regions had assembled at Jerusalem. The crowd appeared not to walk, but to be borne off and whirled as a vortex, rolling along in living waves from the portal of the Praetorium even unto Mount Zion, with howling screams, shrieks, and vociferations such as were never heard in the seditions of Pannonia or in the tumults of the Forum. By degrees the day darkened, like a winter's twilight, such as had been at the death of the great Julius Caesar. It was likewise the Ides of March. I, the continued governor of a rebellious province, was leaning against a column of my basilica, contemplating athwart the dreary gloom these fiends of Tartarus dragging to execution the innocent Nazarene. All around me was deserted. Jerusalem had vomited forth her indwellers through the funeral gate that leads to Germanica. An air of desolation and sadness enveloped me. My guards had joined the cavalry, and the centurion, with a display of power, was endeavoring to keep order. I was left alone, and my breaking heart admonished me that what was passing at that moment appertained rather to the history of the gods than of men. A loud clamor was heard proceeding from Golgotha, which, borne on the wind, seemed to announce an agony such as was never heard by mortal ears. Dark clouds lowered over the pinnacle of the temple and, settling over the sea, covered it as with a veil. So dreadful were the sights that men saw both in the heavens and on earth, that Dionysius, the Areopagite, is reported to have exclaimed, "Either the author of nature is suffering, or the universe is falling apart." Whilst these appalling scenes of nature were transpiring, there was a dreadful earthquake in Lower Egypt, which filled everyone with fear and scared the superstitious Jews almost to death. It is said Balthasar, an aged and learned Jew of Antioch, was found dead after the excitement was over. Whether he died from alarm or grief is not known. He was a strong friend of the Nazarene. Near the first hour of night, I threw my mantle around me and went down into the city toward the gates of Golgotha. The sacrifice was consummated. The crowd was returning home, still agitated, it is true, but gloomy, taciturn, and desperate. What they had witnessed had stricken them with terror and remorse. I also saw my little Roman cohort pass by mournfully, the standard-bearer having veiled his eagle in a token of grief, and I overheard some of the Jewish soldiers murmuring strange words which I did not understand. Others were recounting miracles, very like those which have so often smitten the Romans by the will of the gods. Sometimes groups of men and women would bolt, then, looking back toward Mount Calvary, would remain motionless, in expectation of witnessing some new prodigy. I returned to the Praetorium sad and pensive. On ascending the stairs, the steps of which were still stained with the blood of a Nazarene, I perceived an old man in a suppliant posture, and behind him several Romans in tears. He threw himself at my feet and wept most bitterly. It is painful to see an old man weep, and my heart already being overcharged with grief. We, those strangers, wept together, and in truth it seemed that the tears lay very shallow that day with many whom I perceived in the vast concourse of people. I never witnessed such an extreme revulsion of feeling. Those who betrayed and sold him, those who testified against him, those who cried, "Crucify him! We have his blood," all sunk off like cowardly curs, and washed their teeth with vinegar. As I am told that Jesus taught resurrection and a separation after death, if such should be the fact, I am sure it commenced with this vast crowd. "Father," I said to him after gaining control of my feeling, "who are you, and what is your request?" "I am Joseph of Arimathea," replied he, "and am come to beg you upon my knees permission to bury Jesus of Nazareth." "Your prayer is granted," I said to him, and at the same time I ordered Manulus to take some soldiers with him to superintend the interment, lest it should be profaned. A few days after the sepulchre was found empty, his disciples proclaimed all over the country that Jesus had risen from the dead, as he had foretold. This created more excitement even than the crucifixion. As to its truth, I cannot say for certain, but I have made some investigations of the matter, so you can examine for yourself and see if I am at fault as Herod represents. Joseph buried Jesus in his own tomb. Whether he contemplated his resurrection or calculated to cut himself another, I cannot tell. The day after he was buried, one of the priests came to the praetorium and said they were apprehensive that his disciples intended to steal the body of Jesus and hide it, and then make it appear that he had arisen from the dead, as he had foretold, and of which they were perfectly convinced. This much we know from Scripture. But notice what soldiers wily old Pilate had the Pharisees utilize. I sent him to the captain of the royal guard, Malchus, to tell him to take the Jewish soldiers, place as many around the sepulchre as were needed. Then, if anything should happen, they could blame themselves and not the Romans. Notice how Pilate is defending himself throughout this whole document. When the great excitement arose about the sepulchre being found empty, I found a deeper solitude than ever. I sent for Malchus, who told me he had placed his lieutenant, Ben Isham, with 100 soldiers around the sepulchre. He told me that Isham and the soldiers were very much alarmed by what had occurred there that morning. Here's another factor. Notice that Pilate uses the name of the man who was in charge of the detail guarding the tomb, Ben Isham. Details like that. A name that could be checked out. Was he there? Could he still be talked to about this event? It's things like that that just make this whole document ring true. Now, returning to what Pilate had to say. I sent for this man Isham, who related to me, as near as I can recollect, the following circumstances. He said that at about the beginning of the 4th watch, they saw a soft and beautiful light over the sepulchre. He at first thought that the women had come to embalm the body of Jesus, as was their custom, but he could not see how they could have gotten through the guards. While these thoughts were passing through his mind, behold, the whole place was lighted up, and there seemed to be crowds of the dead in their grave clothes. All seemed to be shouting and filled with ecstasy, while all around and above was the most beautiful music he had ever heard, and the whole air seemed to be full of voices praising God. At this time, there seemed to be a reeling and spinning of the earth, so that he turned so sick and faint that he could not stand on his feet. He said the earth seemed to swim from under him, and his senses left him, so that he knew not what did occur. I asked him in what condition he was when he came to himself. He said he was lying on the ground with his face down. I asked him if he could not have been mistaken as to the light. Was it not day that was coming in the east? He said at first he thought of that, but at a stone's cast it was exceedingly dark. Then he remembered it was too early for day. I asked him if his dizziness might not have come from being awakened up and getting up too suddenly, as it sometimes had that effect. He said he was not, and had not been asleep all night, as the penalty was death for him to sleep on duty. He said he had left some of the soldiers asleep at that time. Some were asleep then. I asked him how long the scene had lasted. He said he did not know, but he thought nearly an hour. He said it was hid by the light of day. I asked him if he went to the sepulchre after he had come to himself, and he said no, because he was afraid. Just as soon as relief came, they all went to their quarters. I asked him if he had been questioned by the priests. He said he had. They wanted him to say it was an earthquake, and they were asleep, and offered him money to say the disciples came and stole Jesus. But he saw no disciples. He did not know that the body was gone until he was told. I asked him what was the private opinion of those priests he had conversed with. He said that some of them thought that Jesus was no man, that he was not a human being, that he was not the son of Mary, that he was the same that was said to be born of the Virgin in Bethlehem, that the same person had been on the earth before with Abraham and Lot, and at many times and places. It seemed to me, if the Jewish theory be true, these conclusions are correct, for they are in accord with this man's life, as is known and testified by both friends and foes, for the elements were no more in his hands than the clay in the hands of the potter. He could convert water into wine. He could change death into life, disease into health. He could calm the seas, still the storms, call up fish with a silver coin in its mouth. Now I say, if he could do all these things, which he did, and many more as the Jews all testify, and it was the doing of these things that created the enmity against him, he was not charged with any criminal offenses, nor was he charged with violating any law, nor of wrongdoing of any individual in person. And all these facts are known to thousands, as well as by his foes as by his friends. I am almost ready to say, as Manuelus did at the cross, truly, this was the Son of God. Now, noble sovereign, this is as near the facts in this case as I can arrive at, and I have taken pains to make the statement very full, so that you may judge of my conduct upon the whole, as I hear Antipater has said many things of me in this matter. With the promise of faithfulness and good wishes to my noble sovereign, I am your most obedient servant, Pontius Pilate. Wasn't that the most amazing account? But is it true? If you want to know our opinion and the opinion of early church fathers, historical evidence for this document, well, click right here for the very first installment. And if you want to learn about a secret meeting between Pilate and Jesus, where Jesus made a prophecy that's not recorded in the Bible, well, click right here to learn about that. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.